This podcast is brought to you by the Down the Middle Podcast.
Welcome back to the AI Analysis Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a book that was recommended to us, and it's a doozy. It's called The Fourth Turning.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Strauss and Howe.
Exactly. And it's not just, another book about generations like millennials versus boomers. It's this really profound kind of sweeping theory. They call it psychohistorical.
Yeah, psychohistory. It tries to apply psychological ideas to, well, huge historical trends. The idea is to understand why societies change and maybe even see patterns, maybe predict things.
Right. And Strauss and Howe argue that American, and maybe Western history too, moves in these recurring cycles, predictable patterns unfolding over centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that generations live through history, but they actually shape it and are shaped by it. It's this constant feedback loop.
That's the core idea. It's ambitious, definitely. They're saying history isn't just random. It moves in these cycles, roughly a human lifespan, say 85 years or so.
And these cycles always end in some kind of big crisis.
Yeah, a crisis followed by renewal.
Oh.
That's the crux of it. So we're going to really try and get into what these cycles are, the different types of generations that pop up, the archetypes.
Okay.
And how trying to understand this framework might give us, well, a pretty unique, maybe even unsettling look at where we are right now.
And it feels relevant because this book, The Fourth Turning, came out back in 97, right?
That's right.
But it's having a huge resurgence. People are talking about it again, especially now that Neil Howe has a new one out. The Fourth Turning is here.
Yeah, it came out in 2023. It definitely put the theory back in the spotlight.
So clearly, whether you buy into the whole theory or not, it's making waves culturally.
Absolutely.
So our goal today is really to unpack the key parts of this theory, give you a solid grasp of what it's saying, its implications. Think of it as maybe a shortcut to understanding why some things happening now might feel familiar, but also why finding solutions feels so hard.
A framework for the chaos, maybe?
It's exactly a framework for the chaos. Okay, so let's unpack this Strauss-Howe generational theory. It's a massive concept covering centuries. What are the sort of building blocks? How does it even propose these huge patterns in something as messy as history?
Right. Well, at its heart, the theory talks about a recurring cycle. Two key things are cycling. Generational personas, they call them archetypes, and historical eras, which they call turnings.
Okay, archetypes and turning.
Yeah. Think of it like a big historical clock, but instead of just ticking hours, it's moving through these really distinct phases or moods. Each turning, they argue, lasts about 21 years.
21 years. Why that number?
It roughly corresponds to a phase of life: childhood, young adulthood, midlife, old age. So it's tied to how long it takes for a generation to move through one of these key life stages.
Makes sense.
And 4 of these turnings make up a full cycle, which they call a saculum.
Saculum. Fancy word.
It is. It's Latin. It means both a long human life and a natural century. So about 80 to 90 years, typically around 85.
Got it. So 4 turnings, 21 years each, makes about 85 years. And what's the pattern within that cycle?
The overall pattern is this. A big crisis happens roughly once every saculum. After the crisis, there's a recovery period, a time of rebuilding. They call this a high.
The high, okay.
During the high, institutions are really strong. People trust them. There's a sense of community, collective purpose. Think post-World War II, maybe?
Right. Strong consensus.
Exactly. But then the generations that come of age after the high, who didn't live through the crisis that created it, they start to push back. They value autonomy, individualism more.
So they start to weaken those strong institutions.
Pretty much, yeah. Often in the name of freedom or personal expression. This gradual weakening leads to a more fragmented, tumultuous society.
Which sounds familiar.
Right. And eventually, this creates the conditions for the next crisis, and the cycle starts over. It's interesting, the very unity of one era kind of sows the seeds for the fragmentation of the next.
Wow. Okay. That's a compelling dynamic. But you mentioned defining a generation is more specific than just, say, everyone born in the 80s. How do they define it? What makes a group a generation in this theory?
Yeah, it's definitely more specific than just birth years. They define a social generation as, okay, yes, people born over roughly 21 years, aligning with that phase of life idea. But there are 3 key things that really define them.
Okay, what are they?
First, and this is crucial, is age, location, in history. It means members of a generation experience major historical events, wars, depressions, big social shifts, while they're all in the same life stage.
Ah, so experiencing WWII as a kid is totally different from experiencing it as a young soldier.
Exactly. That shared experience at a specific life stage shapes you differently. It creates a common perspective, a common set of problems or opportunities.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second thing?
Second is shared beliefs and behaviors. Because they go through these common experiences during their formative years, childhood, young adulthood, they tend to develop similar attitudes, values, ways of acting. It's like a collective personality emerges.
Shaped by the times.
Precisely. And the third criterion is perceived membership. This is basically an awareness within the generation that they are a generation. They recognize they share something with their peers, maybe common slang, cultural tastes, a sense of shared destiny. They see themselves as distinct from older or younger groups.
So it's about where you are, when stuff happens, what you believe because of it, and knowing you're part of that group.
You got it. And, they didn't just invent this stuff. They drew on older thinkers, too. People like Polybius from ancient Greece, Ibn Khaldun from the medieval Islamic world.
Wow, really?
Yeah, people who studied the rise and fall of empires. And more modern sociologists like Ortega y Gasset and Karl Mannheim, who also wrote about generations and social change. So there's a history to thinking this way.
Okay, so it's a big, ambitious theory with some historical grounding. But it sounds deterministic, like history is fated to repeat. That feels kind of weird, doesn't it? How did academics react to this? I bet it wasn't all applause.
You bet right. The reaction was very mixed, definitely not uniform applause. On one side, some people really admired it. They praised the bold and imaginative thesis, the way it pulled together lots of historical threads.
Any big names?
Well, Al Gore famously called their first book, Generations, the most stimulating book on American history he'd read, sent copies to Congress, apparently.
Wow.
And the theory has definitely been influential. You see its ideas pop up in marketing, business strategy, generational studies. It provides a framework people find useful.
But there's always a but.
There's always a but. A lot of historians and social scientists were, and are, very critical. They called it overly deterministic, like you said, implying we don't have free will, that history just follows this rigid script.
Yeah, that's the feeling I got.
Others labeled it unfalsifiable, meaning you can't really prove it wrong or even pseudoscientific. Some reviews were pretty harsh, calling it kooky or an elaborate historical horoscope.
Ouch, horoscope.
Yeah. The main criticism is often the lack of hard empirical evidence for such sweeping claims, and the argument that it oversimplifies things massively.
How so?
Critics say it ignores or downplays other huge factors that shape people in history, like economic class, race, gender, religion. Can you really lump millions of diverse people into one generational personality based just on birth year and shared events? It's a valid question.
It is. So praise for the big picture, criticism for the lack of maybe scientific rigor, and for glossing over diversity within generations. How did Strauss and Howe respond to that?
Well, they acknowledged the criticism. They said, look, obviously any generation has all sorts of different people in it. They weren't trying to say everyone in a generation is identical.
Okay, fair enough.
But they argued that as a social unit, the generational grouping is incredibly powerful. Maybe even more powerful than things like class or race in shaping the overall mood and direction of society at certain times.
That's a big claim.
It is. They saw their work as identifying broad tendencies, not predicting specific futures for individuals. They wanted to offer a unifying vision, a way to understand America's story, especially when things felt fragmented.
And the seasons analogy. Did they use that to address the determinism critique?
Exactly. They compared the turnings to seasons. Spring always follows winter, summer follows spring, etc. The order is fixed, but like real seasons, the exact timing can shift a bit, the intensity can vary. It's not rigid prophecy, it's about patterns and probabilities.
Okay. So despite the academic debate, it clearly struck a chord with some people. You mentioned its cultural impact.
Oh, definitely. For example, Steve Bannon, who was chief strategist for President Trump for a while, is a big proponent. Yeah. He even made a documentary, Generation Zero, that heavily featured the Strauss-Howe theory, especially the fourth turning crisis aspect. A historian, David Kaiser, noted Bannon focused on that idea that every 80 years or so, America goes through a crisis that tears down the old order and builds a new one.
Wow. So it's influenced political thinking at high levels.
It seems so, which just shows whether you think it's scientifically sound or not, the theory offers a compelling narrative. It gives a sense of order to history, which people often crave, especially in confusing times, even if that order is debatable.
All right, so we have the basic idea of cycles and generations. Let's really get into these turnings. You mentioned the seasons analogy, 4 distinct stages, each with its own feel. What are these 4 seasons of history? What defines each one?
Right, the seasons analogy is really helpful. It suggests this natural, almost organic flow growth, maturity, decay, and then rebirth. So the first turning is the high. Think of it as spring. This comes right after a major crisis has been resolved.
Okay, the storm has passed.
Exactly. And what happens? Institutions, government, schools, civic groups, they're strong, they're trusted. There's a feeling of collective purpose, confidence. Society feels unified.
People pull together.
Yeah. Individualism is kind of dialed down. The focus is on community, building things together. There's a consensus on where society should go, but there's a downside.
Which is?
That very conformity can feel stifling, especially if you're outside the mainstream. It's stable, but maybe a bit rigid. Strauss and Howe point to the post-World War II era in America as a classic high. Say 1946, roughly up to JFK's assassination in '63.
Okay, I can picture that. The era of big projects, Levittown, that sort of thing. A lot of perceived unity, on the surface at least.
Right. For you listening, think about that sense of shared national purpose you see in films or read about from that time. That's the feeling of a high.
So you have this strong, unified high, often led by the generation that just won the crisis. But that can't last forever, can it? What starts to sort of chip away at that unity? What comes next?
No, it definitely doesn't last. The pendulum swings. After the high comes the second turning. The awakening. This is like summer.
Awakening. Sounds intense.
It is. It's a major shift. Those strong institutions from the high, now they come under attack. People start questioning the conformity, the materialism, the perceived spiritual emptiness of the previous era.
Why? What are they looking for?
They're looking for personal meaning, spiritual autonomy, self-awareness, authenticity. There's a rebellion against social discipline. Young activists especially look back at the high and see it as boring, restrictive, maybe even hypocritical.
So it's a reaction against the perceived perfection of the high.
Exactly. It's often a cultural and spiritual upheaval. Strauss and Howe identify the most recent American awakening as the consciousness revolution. Think mid-1960s onwards, campus protests, civil rights struggles, inner-city riots, feminism, environmentalism, stretching into the tax revolts and cultural shifts of the early 80s.
The 60s and 70s, basically.
Pretty much. A time of challenging authority, demanding individual liberation, breaking norms. If you remember that era, or have studied it, that focus on individual expression, sometimes leading to chaos, that's the awakening vibe.
Okay, so first, unity in the high, then intense questioning and individualism in the awakening. It seems like society is stretching its legs, maybe going through some growing pains. Where does the cycle go from there, after all that questioning?
Well, the pendulum keeps swinging. After the heat of the awakening comes the third turning. The unraveling. Think of this as autumn.
Unraveling. Doesn't sound great.
It's kind of the mirror image of the high. Remember how institutions were strong and trusted in the high? Now, in the unraveling, they're weak. They're widely distrusted. People see them as corrupt, inefficient, maybe irrelevant.
So trust goes down. What goes up?
Individualism. It doesn't just exist, it flourishes. It becomes the dominant cultural force. Society gets more atomized. People focus on their own lives, their own pursuits. There's often a sense of cynicism about collective projects.
So less we, more me.
Very much so. Cultural fragmentation increases. Shared values erode. It can be a time of great personal freedom and enjoyment, but also division and a feeling that the center isn't holding. Strauss and Howe say the last unraveling in the U.S. started around the 1980s.
Yeah, 80s and 90s.
Yeah, through the 90s and into the early 2000s. Think of the long boom economy, but also the rise of the culture wars, increasing political polarization, declining trust in media, government, everything. For a lot of you listening, this might be the era you grew up in. That feeling of anything goes, maybe, but also growing division.
And that brings us to the big one, the one the book is named after, the fourth turning. If unraveling is autumn with things falling apart, then this next stage must be winter. What happens when that fragmentation hits its peak? What's the crisis really like?
Exactly. Winter. The fourth turning is the crisis. And yes, it's as transformative and difficult as it sounds. This is an era of major destruction, major upheaval. It often involves war or revolution or maybe a complete economic collapse, something that threatens the nation's survival.
So the stakes are incredibly high.
Existential, really. Institutional life, which was already weak and distrusted, essentially gets destroyed and then rebuilt. Or entirely new institutions are created in response to the threat.
How does society react? Does individualism persist?
No, it flips completely. Civic authority revives dramatically. People demand leadership, order. Cultural expression shifts away from individual concerns and towards community purpose, collective survival. People start seeing themselves as part of a larger group again because they have to. Individualism seems like a luxury you can't afford.
Shared fate takes over.
Precisely. The last big crisis in the U.S., according to the theory, started with the 1929 stock market crash, went through the Great Depression, and climaxed with the end of World War II in 1945.
Okay. The Depression and WWII, that was definitely a crisis.
Absolutely. And the generation that came of age then, the GI generation, the ones Strauss and Howe call a hero archetype, their whole outlook was shaped by it. Confident, collective-minded, ready to build. They epitomized the mood of that crisis.
So for us listening now, the crisis is the ultimate test, where society basically has to redefine itself under pressure.
That's the idea. It's the crucible where the old order burns away and a new one is forged, often quickly and under duress. And interestingly, Strauss and Howe argue that the millennial generation today shows some similar traits to that GI generation rising civic engagement, a more collective outlook suggesting they are potentially the hero generation for this current crisis.
So these four turnings, High Awakening Unraveling Crisis, make the whole cycle the seculum. You said it's about 85 years. Is there reason for that specific length? Is it tied to human lifespan somehow?
Yeah, that's a really key part of the theory. Each turning is about 21 years, right? So 4 turns makes about 85 years, which is roughly the length of a long human life.
It's okay.
And this isn't random. It's tied directly to those biologically and socially defined phases of life we talked about. Childhood, young adulthood, midlife, old age.
How does that drive the cycle?
The idea is that historical events shape a generation when they're young. Then, as that generation grows older and moves into positions of power as parents, leaders, voters, in midlife and old age, they start shaping history based on the lessons they learned and the attitudes they formed when they were young.
Ah, so it's a handover. Each generation reacts to the one before and sets the stage for the one after.
Exactly. It's like a generational relay race driving the cycle forward. As each generation ages into the next life phase, adopting new roles and perspectives, the whole mood and behavior of society shifts. That shift is the turning.
Got it. And the seasons analogy helps keep it from being too rigid.
Right. The order is fixed. High, awakening, unraveling, crisis. Always in that order. But the exact start and end dates might wiggle a bit, just like winter might start early one year. Strauss and Howe actually charted this out over centuries. They identified something like 26 turnings across 7 saecula in Anglo-American history, going way back to the 1400s, showing this rhythm, this pattern, repeating again and again. Even though the specific events are always different, it's a huge historical canvas they're painting.
Okay, before we get into how these specific generations, these archetypes, actually play out through history, which sounds fascinating, let's pause for a quick word from our sponsor.
How's it going, everybody? It's Jake from the Down the Middle podcast, and I'm going to take a quick moment to invite you to check out our show, which airs every other Thursday at 8:30 p.m. on YouTube. If you love pro wrestling, you're definitely going to want to check this out. We talk about the latest in pro wrestling.
AEW's pay-per-views are rough, man. And it's obvious, like, Tony Khan is booking for Tony Khan, and it's obvious because Tony Khan has clinical freaking ADHD. But the kind where, like, you can hyper-focus on the thing you love. He's like, I legitimately want to watch wrestling for 7 hours. It's like, Tony.
Now everybody else does.
Hardly
Yeah.
anybody else does.
We talk about some of our favorite things in pro wrestling.
One of the best promos ever. Like, can we just say, like, I had fucking goosebumps. And here's the thing, I know it's a work, but I'm watching that and I'm like, I think MJF might have duped somebody.
And we have a hot take here and there, too.
Nothing against Riho, it's just like, do you think the audience is fucking stupid? Riho weighs 98 pounds.
The vast majority of great moments in professional wrestling have nothing to do with the move. Don't get me wrong, the moves are part of it. Cena's like, I don't even remember how I won. Everybody remembers this.
But the best part about our show is that you are part of the conversation. So check out the show and join in the fun.
All right, we're back. So we've got the 4 turnings, the seasons of history. But the theory also talks about 4 repeating generational archetypes. These sound like the characters playing roles within those seasons. What are these archetypes, and how do they link up with the turnings? It sounds like your childhood turning really defines your generation's personality.
That's exactly right. The archetype is determined by the turning a generation experiences during its childhood and youth. That formative experience shapes their collective persona for life. It's like the software they're running on. So the first archetype is the prophet or the idealist. They grow up during a high.
Okay, the post-crisis stability period.
Right, a time of strong community consensus. This tends to make them value-driven, focused on morals, principles. Later in life, though, they often become the ones who challenge the very consensus they grew up in, sparking the next awakening with their critiques.
Interesting. So they uphold, then question. Any examples?
Historically, think of the transcendental generation in the U.S. who led the Second Great Awakening, or the missionary generation pushing for social reforms like suffrage and prohibition. More recently, the baby boomers, born 4360, they came of age challenging the norms during the consciousness revolution. Classic prophets.
Okay, prophet archetype. Born in a high, what's next?
Next up is the nomad, or reactive generation. They enter childhood during an awakening.
The time of questioning and social upheaval.
Exactly. Society's focus is on adult issues, self-discovery. The kids often feel overlooked, maybe underprotected. This shapes them to be pragmatic, skeptical, very individualistic, self-reliant. They learn not to trust big institutions or grand ideals.
Sounds like survivors.
Very much so. They value freedom, authenticity, keeping options open. Historical examples. The Gilded Generation, maybe, known for their materialism after the Civil War.
Yeah.
Or the famous Lost Generation after World War I. And today, that's Generation X, born 6181.
Got it. Nomad reactive, born in an awakening.
Yeah.
Third archetype.
Third is the hero, or the civic generation. They grow up during an unraveling.
The period of weak institutions and strong individualism.
Right, but interestingly, growing up amidst that fragmentation seems to make them crave community and collective action as young adults. They become optimistic, confident, team-oriented. They're the builders. They want to restore order and civic purpose.
So they react against the cynicism of the unraveling.
Precisely. Think of the generation that founded the U.S. government, the Republican generation, or the GI generation, the greatest generation, who fought WWII and built the post-war world. And today, the theory pegs millennials, born 82 or 5, as the hero archetype, focused on community and collective solutions.
Okay, hero civic, born in an unraveling. That leaves one more.
The last one is the artist, or adaptive generation. They enter childhood during a crisis.
Wow, growing up during war or depression. That must be intense.
Incredibly intense. Society is mobilized, focused on survival, demanding sacrifice and conformity. This shapes the artist generation to be supportive of institutions. Cautious, agreeable, often skilled in technical or support roles. They adapt to the needs of the collective.
So they're not the rebels of the leaders, more the facilitators.
Generally, yes. They provide the social glue, the expertise to make things run. Think of the progressive generation who implemented reforms, or the silent generation, born 2542, who worked within the post-WWII system, and the generation growing up now. The homeland generation, born roughly 2006 onwards, fits the artist archetype, raised in an era focused on security and collective threats.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, putting actual history onto this framework. The theory uses specific generations across centuries to show these patterns. Can you walk us through some key examples? Show us how this generational engine, actually turned through Anglo-American history.
Absolutely. Seeing the examples really makes the patterns click. It shows how a generation's youth shapes its adulthood, which then shapes the next turning. Let's jump around a bit to see different archetypes in action. Go way back to late medieval England during a very rough patch. You had the Arthurian generation, born 1433-1460. They're a hero archetype. Grew up during England's messy retreat from the 100 Years' War, rising chaos back home that's an unraveling. This made them pragmatic builders, like King Henry VII, who ended the Wars of the Roses, restoring order.
Okay, hero generation, fixing and unraveling.
Then came the humanist generation, artist, 1461-1482. They grew up during the crisis of the Wars of the Roses. Shaped by that conflict, they became adaptive, focused on education, fitting into the reviving church and state structures. Think scholars, poets, administrators. King Edward V was one of them, briefly. Jump forward to the Reformation Seculum. Big changes. The Reformation generation, prophet, 1483-1511, grew up in the relatively stable high after the Wars of the Roses ended, became deeply moralistic, value-driven, As adults, they rebelled, sparking religious fervor, challenging the old ways. Sir Thomas More is a good example.
Prophet challenging the high.
Then you get a really vivid nomad example, the Cavalier generation, 1618-1647. Grew up during the intense religious conflicts leading to the English Civil War. That's an awakening, felt neglected, became risk-takers, reacted against Puritan strictness. Very individualistic, focused on pleasure, maybe a bit wild. King Charles II, the merry monarch, kind of embodies that vibe.
Okay, nomads reacting to an awakening. What about in America?
Fast forward to the New World Seculum. The glorious generation, hero, 1648-1673. Grew up during an unraveling period in England and the colonies. Got better education, became pragmatic builders, fought in local wars, involved in the Glorious Revolution. They built stuff, insurance systems, public works, paper money. Very civic-minded heroes. Now, leading up to the American Revolution, the Revolutionary Seculum, first, the Awakening generation, prophet, 1701-1723. Grew up in a colonial high, mostly born in America. As adults, they attacked the moral complacency of their elders, sparking the First Great Awakening. Think Benjamin Franklin questioning everything.
Prophet sparks an awakening. Makes sense.
Then the Liberty generation, Nomad, 1724-1741. Grew up during that awakening, became pragmatic, independent, maybe a bit cynical of big ideals. George Washington, John Adams were part of this. Many signers of the Declaration. Self-reliant nomads.
Washington and Nomad. Interesting.
Yeah, fits the pragmatic, non-ideological leader mold in some ways. Then the Republican generation, hero, 1742-1766, grew up during the subsequent unraveling, questioning empire. They became the ultimate institution builders, fought the revolution, wrote the Constitution, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Classic heroes creating order. Jumped to the Civil War Saculum, the Transcendental Generation prophet, 1792-1821. Grew up in the post-revolutionary high, deeply moralistic, started the Second Great Awakening, pushed for reforms. Abraham Lincoln is the quintessential example here.
Lincoln is a prophet. Wow.
Then the Gilded Generation, Nomad, 1822-1842, came of age during rising tensions, immigration, crazy commercialism and awakening, became pragmatic, maybe materialistic, distrustful of grand causes. Most Civil War soldiers were from this generation, fought out of duty or necessity, perhaps, more than idealism. And getting closer to our time, the Great Power Seculum, the missionary generation, prophet 1860-1802, grew up in the post-Civil War high, became idealistic reformers, muckrakers, suffragists, prohibitionists. Later, they were the wise elders of the New Deal and WWII.
Prophets again trying to fix the world.
Then the Lost Generation, Nomad, 1883-1900, came of age during WWI and the cultural chaos after an awakening. Disillusioned, individualistic, wandering. Hemingway captured that feeling. Classic nomads.
Yeah, you can feel that disillusionment.
Then the GI generation, hero, 1901-1924, the greatest generation, grew up in the unraveling of the Roaring Twenties, then hit by the crisis of the Depression and WWII, became incredibly civic-minded, confident team players who built the post-war world.
The ultimate hero archetype in action.
And finally, the silent generation, artists, 1925-1942, grew up during that intense crisis, learned to conform, adapt, work within the system, became the cautious technicians and professionals who helped run the institutions the GIs built, often felt they missed out on the idealism or rebellion of other generations.
Wow. Laying it out like that, the patterns are really striking. You see the archetypes reacting to the previous generation and the times they grew up in. It really paints a picture of history as this generational ebb and flow. Okay, so what about us, the generations living right now? How do we fit into this picture?
Right, bringing it to the present day, our current millennial seculum. We see the same archetypes playing their roles, driving our current history. You've got the baby boom generation, prophet, born 1943-1960, came of age during the awakening of the 60s. They've been defined by their idealism, their focus on values, challenging norms from civil rights to the environment. They fit that prophet role of questioning and trying to instill moral vision.
Okay, the boomers as prophets.
Then comes Generation X, or the 13th gen, as Strauss and Howe originally called them, Nomad, born 1961-1981. Grew up during the awakening and the start of the unraveling, often described as latchkey kids, underprotected while society focused on adult issues. This made them pragmatic, skeptical, individualistic nomads, and as we'll discuss, their current leadership roles really shaped by that.
Right, the nomads.
Following them, the millennial generation, hero, born 1982-2005, Strauss and Howe actually predicted back in the 90s that this generation would be different from Gen X, more protected, more optimistic, more group-oriented. They saw them shaping up as a hero generation, similar to the GIS. And much of that seems to have played out. They tend to be more civic-minded, focused on collective action, building communities.
Millennials as new heroes.
And finally, the youngest currently identified cohort, the Homeland generation. Artist, born roughly 2006-2029. The name comes from the Department of Homeland Security, created after 9/11. Growing up in this era of heightened security, surveillance, and collective crises, like the pandemic, climate change, they seem to be developing the traits of an artist generation more cautious, perhaps more conformist, focused on safety, and adapting to the world the older generations are leaving them.
So the cycle continues, right into today. You can really see how each generation's early experiences might be shaping their current attitudes and actions. Okay, so we've mapped the historical cycles and the generations alive today. Now, let's focus squarely on where the theory says we are right now. Neil Howe is quite clear. We're deep into a fourth turning, a crisis. This was predicted back in the 90s. What does this crisis look like now, according to the theory, and what does it mean for all of us living through it?
It's pretty remarkable, yeah. They predicted a crisis period starting around 2005 and likely climaxing in the 2020s. And well, here we are. Howe does note that the cycles seem to be getting a bit longer, dilating, he calls it.
Why is that happening?
Mostly because life phases are stretching out. People marry later, have kids later, settle into careers later. Even political leaders are older on average now compared to, say, 80 years ago. These key transitions happen maybe 5-7 years later than they used to.
So the whole generational clock is slowing down a bit.
Seems like it. Which paradoxically might make things feel more stuck for young adults today. Howe compares it to the 17th or 18th centuries when economic growth was slower and opportunities felt delayed. That feeling of being on hold can really intensify the sense of crisis.
It definitely resonates with a lot of experiences today. Let's talk about the generations in charge, or coming into charge. Gen X, the Nomads, are hitting midlife, taking on leadership roles. You described their style as honey badger leadership. What does that actually look like? How does their nomad background shape how they lead during this crisis?
It's fascinating and kind of counterintuitive. Gen X grew up feeling like the throwaway kids, right? During the consciousness revolution, the divorce boom, the child devil movies of the 80s, there was this sense that society wasn't really looking out for them. They had to be self-reliant.
Right, fend for themselves.
Exactly. So they developed this deep skepticism of institutions, of groupthink. I only get ahead by being different, don't trust the system. Very individualistic, very contrarian.
Okay, so how does that translate to leadership? Seems like they wouldn't want to lead institutions they distrust.
Well, that's where the honey badger style comes in. The honey badger is known for being fearless, aggressive, doing whatever it takes. Gen X leaders often approach problems very pragmatically. They're less bound by ideology or tradition. It's like, let's just try stuff, rip it apart, smash it against the wall, see what works. Survival over purity.
Okay, so very results-oriented, even if it's messy.
Yeah. And this pragmatism, this contrarian streak, even shows up politically. Howe notes Gen X has consistently leaned more Republican than other generations at similar life stages, and they were the cohort most supportive of Trump, seeing him perhaps as someone willing to break norms to get things done. They value effectiveness, even if it means cutting corners.
So the irony is huge then. The generation that felt abandoned by institutions is now supposed to fix them or lead them.
Exactly. It's deeply ironic. They learned to survive without strong communities, and now, as elders, society needs them to be solid anchors, builders of walls, providing structure. And look at their parenting. They're often hyper-protective of their own kids, the complete opposite of their own upbringing.
It's just like the lost generation nomads after WWI.
Precisely. That same pattern. Pragmatic, anti-idealist, but fiercely protective parents. So their leadership might look unconventional, even disruptive, but that very pragmatism might be what's needed to navigate a complex crisis.
That's a really vivid picture of Gen X leadership. How does that contrast with the millennials, the hero archetype? They're now young adults, moving into their prime working years during this crisis. How are they responding differently?
The contrast is stark, really highlights the archetype differences. If Gen X felt like they had to sail their own lifeboats because the ship was sinking, millennials are trying to lash all their lifeboats together.
Ah, the collective instinct.
Totally. They have this strong sense of shared identity, a feeling that we're all in this together. If the system fails, they feel they need to save each other. You see it in things like their investment patterns, more likely to use collective vehicles like target date funds, less individual stock picking maybe.
So they trust the group more.
It seems so. They have a more natural orientation towards collective action, towards building and reforming institutions rather than just working around them. They expect systems to work, and when they don't, they organize to fix them. Very much like the GI generation facing the Depression and WWII looking for big collective solutions. They demand systemic change, collective responsibility.
Okay, so we're in a crisis. Society mobilizes. How does this usually hit the economy, particularly finance, wealth? Is it just chaos, or are there patterns there too?
Oh, there are definite patterns, often quite counterintuitive ones. During a crisis, the government and society mobilize resources against the big threat war, pandemic, collapse. Individual profit takes a backseat to collective survival.
Markets get harnessed, as you said.
Exactly. And how do you pay for this massive mobilization? Howe points to the three things governments always resort to: tax, borrow, and inflate.
Tax and borrow, okay. But inflate. Isn't inflation usually seen as bad?
Normally, yes. But in a crisis, inflation can actually be a tool. It's a way to share the burden. It subtly takes value from people holding fixed assets, like creditors holding bonds, and effectively transfers resources to fund the collective effort. It helps pay down massive government debt incurred during the crisis.
So inflation can actually reduce inequality in a strange way.
It often does, temporarily. We saw this after WWII. High inflation, combined with high taxes on the wealthy, significantly reduced the wealth gap and helped manage the huge war debt. It's not pretty, but it can be effective for collective survival.
What about financial repression? What's that?
That's when the government basically forces people or institutions to buy its debt, often at low interest rates, keeps borrowing costs down. You saw this during WWII, and the Civil War banks were essentially required to hold government bonds. It limits financial freedom, but ensures the government gets funded.
So individual risk-taking, like crypto or meme stocks, that probably fades.
Generally, yes. The focus shifts dramatically from individual speculation to systemic stability. The government often steps in as a massive backstop, think bailouts, to prevent total collapse. Collective security trumps individual financial freedom.
It's a stark picture. Less individual freedom, more collective action, even forced burden sharing through inflation. But you also mentioned this idea, conflict is the incubator of community. How does that intense pressure of a crisis actually forge stronger bonds? And how does society eventually get out of this winter phase?
Right. That conflict incubator idea is key. Thinkers like Weber, Durkheim, noted this: facing a common enemy or an existential threat forces people to put aside smaller differences. A powerful sense of us emerges. Shared sacrifice, shared purpose. It creates incredibly strong communal bonds. Think of the Blitz spirit in London, or the unity in the U.S. after Pearl Harbor. Individualism recedes, civic virtue rises. People trust each other more, and they trust the newly aligned, often more powerful, central authority that's leading the fight.
So the crisis itself builds the community needed to overcome it.
In many ways, yes. As for getting out of the crisis, history suggests a few main paths, all leading to some kind of consolidation where the nation's future hangs in the balance, followed by the end of the crisis and the start of a new high.
Okay, what are those paths?
One possibility is civil war, or something like it. Not necessarily North versus South again, but extreme internal division, political breakdown, maybe regional splits, paralysis of institutions. The fabric just tears apart.
That sounds grim.
It is. Another path is an external crisis, a major threat from outside a war, maybe that forces the country to unite against a common enemy. Think the revolution uniting the colonies, or WWII pulling the U.S. out of the Depression.
So an outside enemy forces internal unity.
Often, yes. A third path is what you might call internal realigning or regeneracy. This is where society fundamentally rebuilds institutions and rewrites the social contract from within, without a full-blown civil war or external invasion. Think of the New Deal era, a massive internal restructuring in response to the Depression crisis. Old ways die, new ones are born.
So internal conflict, external conflict, or internal rebuilding.
Those seem to be the main roots. They all involve intense struggle and change, a period where everything feels at stake. And only after that consolidation, when the crisis finally ends, can society enter a new high, a period of stability, renewed institutions, and a sense of collective purpose, like the U.S. felt in 1946, ready to shape the post-war world.
It's a powerful framework for understanding national cycles. But what about the rest of the world? Is this just an American or Anglo-American thing, or are these cycles happening everywhere? Are we seeing a global fourth turning?
That's a really interesting question, and Howe does argue that these cycles seem to be syncing up more globally now.
Why would that be?
Probably because of globalization. Shared technology, interconnected economies, global media. Major events and trends ripple across the world much faster than they used to. So the mood of a turning, especially a crisis, might be felt in many places simultaneously, even if the local details differ.
Any examples of this sync up?
Well, look at world leaders today. Putin in Russia, Modi in India, Xi in China, many leaders in Europe. They often come from generations that would be considered boomers or equivalent in their own country's cycles. They were born after the last major national crisis, like WWII or their nation's founding, and now they're presiding over new crises, often with a strong nationalist or centralizing flavor.
Wow, that's a striking observation. Boomers leading the world into a new crisis phase.
It fits the pattern, and it highlights another key point. This era we're in now, this crisis, almost no one alive today remembers the last one as an adult. Think about it. We're seeing all these 80th anniversaries of WWII events right now. VE Day, Hiroshima.
Because the people who lived through it as adults are mostly gone.
Exactly. They'd be 100 or older now. So as a global society, we're navigating this incredibly dangerous period without the living memory of how the last one was handled, how it felt, what mistakes were made, which makes understanding these historical patterns, these cycles, maybe more important than ever. It suggests we're all kind of in the same historical season, even if our weather looks a bit different locally. Hashtag outro.
So wrapping this up, what does it all mean for you listening right now? We've journeyed through the fourth turning, this really compelling theory of generational cycles. We've looked at the archetypes prophet, nomad, hero, artist, and seen how they seem to reappear throughout history, shaping events right up to this moment.
Yeah, it really offers a different lens, doesn't it? A way to maybe understand the deeper currents under the chaos of daily news. Why generations seem to clash, why institutions rise and fall, why history sometimes feels like it's repeating itself.
It does. And it highlights how these crises, as difficult and destructive as they are, can also be periods of intense social change, rebuilding, and maybe even renewed community, even if that community is forged in, well, pretty tough circumstances.
That idea of conflict incubating community really sticks with you. It asks us to think about our own role, our own generation's role in this current moment.
Right. And that final thought is really provocative. Consider that idea, conflict is the incubator of community. As you look around in your own life, your town, your country, the world, where do you see that happening? Where are people coming together because of shared struggles? What does that tell you about resilience, about connection, even when things feel like they're falling apart? Maybe understanding this framework helps you spot those moments of potential rebuilding.
Absolutely. The theory isn't about saying the future is predetermined. It's about understanding the likely mood, the challenges, the generational dynamics of an era. The real question it leaves us with isn't if we're in a crisis, but how we respond. How do we, individually and collectively, navigate this winter? What kind of spring do we want to build afterwards?
It definitely gives you a lot to think about, looking beyond the immediate headlines to those longer, deeper rhythms of history. We hope this exploration of the fourth turning has given you a valuable shortcut to understanding this complex theory and maybe spark some new ways of seeing the world around you.
Yeah, hopefully it provides some context for the times we're living in.
Thank you for listening.